Morning, everyone. Thank you for coming on a Sunday morning. It is a great pleasure for me, a privilege actually, to be here today. I would like to thank Okadera-san and everybody else in the committee here involved in the organization of this very important project, which has been going on for several years and hopefully will continue for many more years. It's been nice for me to meet old friends and old colleagues, and also to be able to have met new friends and new colleagues, and I hope that we will continue the conversation, perhaps also in other places as well. I must say that in these 3 days, since I've been joining the proceedings here, I've learned so much. So at this point, I don't know how much more I can contribute with my paper, but still, I hope that I can kind of add something to the conversation moving forward. So let me begin with this is what I would like to cover in my paper. I will discuss how interactions with foreign cultures have shaped Japanese religions. And by Japanese religions, I mean really pretty much everything that relates with interactions with the sacred. I don't really mean particular like sects or organizations and all that. Really is like religiosity in general. And so like beliefs, practices, and representations. I will begin with Okinoshima in particular, obviously, and more broadly on Munakata and its beliefs and their place in the history of Japanese religiosity. As you can see, I will start like small from Okinoshima, then expand a little bit more with Munakata and see cults in general, see cosmologies, so bigger, and then there will be some conclusions. It is a large set of topics that I will try to cover today, so I have been forced to do some simplifications, and I apologize for that, but I would be happy to follow up if there is any questions later on. I must also say that Santa Barbara in California, where my university is located in a place that is very much similar to Munakata. There's the sea and the mountains on the back, and there are islands in front of us. And so it's kind of interesting to see this similarity. The indigenous, the First Nations, the indigenous people there in the area of Santa Barbara, the Chumash people, were also sailors, and so they were commuting between the mainland and the islands, and they had developed the little that we know today, but they have certainly developed some sea cults and sea practices that I would imagine they're mostly lost today. But again, this is another interesting point of similarity between where I'm coming from and what I will be talking about. Maybe I should also say that in my talk, I will be talking about cults. I know that in Japanese, the katakana karto is kind of a bad word, but that's not necessarily true in English. I mean, cult is a word that comes from Latin and refers to a set of religious practices and beliefs. I personally don't like to talk about beliefs or faith because it's a very much Protestant idea of religion. It's something that is like personal beliefs or personal faith. Whereas here, what we're talking about is not necessarily what people believe or not. It involves a certain degree of understanding, but it also involves a set of practices, activities that sometimes go beyond the specificity of the sacred. It involves like, boat makers, for example, all types of things. So I would use, whenever I use cult, it's not in a negative way at all. It's a continuation of the use in Latin that refers to like religious practices, religious ideas, just to clarify things. Okinoshima itself, with the nearby region, is now, thanks to everybody's efforts here, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and so it has become known all over the world. The World Heritage Site area in itself is a microcosmos of the entire history of Japanese, or say, Japanese history and religion. It includes Kofun funerary sites and perhaps even older, like Jomon artifacts and this type of things. We know almost, at least I know almost nothing about the belief system and the worldview behind the construction of Kofun, and we also know very little about the actual practices, religious practices associated with them. Of course, there are a lot of theories and a lot of inferences can be made, but nobody was there and they've left no written sources. But it is safe to assume that they show an early set of ideas connecting this world and the afterlife, and possibly the materiality, places, and objects with spiritual beings. So there is this type of religious system that is already in place, although again, like I said, we know very little about it. Now, of course, many other things have happened there in this area since then, since the Kofun period, and they have resulted in a rich and complex religious and cultural system. So Okinoshima is this precious little jewel in the middle of the sea between Japan and the Asian continent. Over many centuries, seafarers have stopped there and deposited on Okinoshima gifts, many of which are precious artifacts and which are now national treasures of Japan. And again, very little is known about the motivations and the beliefs behind the offerings of objects on the islands, but making votive offerings before beginning a difficult endeavor, or as a sign of gratitude after a successful endeavor, is a common practice in many religious traditions, not only in Japan, but also again in other religious traditions of the world. And in fact, sea travel, especially at this early time, was one of the most challenging, difficult, dangerous endeavors in early Japan. So of course that required an extra layer, an extra effort of divine protection. So of course that would justify the use of precious objects, because the more precious the objects, the more important is the degree of protection that is, and the degree of gratitude that is given to the divinities because of that. Now the next slide is a series of ex votos from Italy. And in fact, in the Catholic tradition, the one that I'm somehow familiar with, people make or used to make votive offerings to saints to ask for help and bring another offering after they have received help, and the offering that they bring after they've been rescued by the saints are called ex voto, after the wish, which may be similar to what happened in Okinoshima. Right, we have these kind of votive offerings being given to the islands, either again before or after. In this particular case, these two images come from Naples in southern Italy, and they represent parts of the body of people that required assistance, medical assistance, let's say, from the saints, and after the saints helped the person heal, an equivalent of the parts of the body made with metal, or some type of precious metal like bronze or silver in some cases, were given to the church and to the saints as like a sign of gratitude. The reason I mentioned Catholicism, the Catholic tradition here, again, this happens in Italy, but it can also be found in most other Catholic parts of the world, and especially until the early modern period, until the Counter-Reformation, until the 1600s, let's say. And the reason I mention this is because I would like to point out that Christianity, especially medieval period in Christianity, did not necessarily reject existing cults and beliefs. Of course, there was a contraposition between Christianity and Islam and Christianity and Judaism to a certain extent. But the local traditions, the local cults in the regions were not rejected at all by Christianity. They were, in fact, they were actively incorporated in the Christian cult. Think about the saints, think about all kinds of like special food that is eaten at particular religious festivals and all that. Those are certainly not in the Bible, they are not in the Gospels. Those are part of the local traditions of those places, and that shows a very deep interactions with Christianity, especially in the first like 1,500 years of the diffusion of that religion. And this situation of the Catholic tradition all over the world is very similar to me to what is called in Japan Shinbutsu Shugo, because you have local traditions and you have this translocal Buddhism coming in and interacting in multiple ways, and not necessarily in a rejection. I know that I'm saying this because I've realized that in Japan there seems to be an idea, which is very much Protestant, that Christianity always eliminates traditional religions. That happened, of course, to a certain extent in the Roman period, but again, a lot of other elements were incorporated into Christianity. With the modern period, things after the Protestant Reformation, things change, and even the Catholics begin to reject actively and violently religious tradition. So what Professor Sand discussed yesterday about Polynesia, that's pretty much a result of modern developments of Christianity. Sorry about this parenthesis, but I think it's relevant to our conversation, in this kind of international networks of ideas and practices. So it also seems at some point that these types of offerings here ceased to decrease, right? There were fewer and fewer people going to Okinoshima to leave offerings there until they ceased completely before the beginning or around the beginning of the medieval period here in Japan. This may be related to the change in sea routes, because again, people were going to the continent perhaps from Hakata or from, I don't know, Nagasaki rather than from Munakata. So Okinoshima was no longer a central point in these international sea routes. But it may also be possible that the disappearance of this practice of offering objects to Okinoshima might have been related to changes in votive practices related to the diffusion of Buddhism. Numerous Buddhist texts report that seafaring, going at sea, was an intrusive activity, that disturbed sea divinities, and especially the dragon kings. And sailors were often forced to throw in the sea parts of their precious cargo, sometimes even the entire cargo that they were carrying, so that the dragons could be placated. And sometimes that cargo included Buddhist scriptures, Buddhist statues. Sometimes even the Buddhist monks were thrown at sea so that the dragons could be pacified. Now, this slide here, so this is an image, it's a map from early Edo period Japan. It's a map of earthquakes. So it is not directly related to our topic, but you see Japan is all the lines, all the 66 provinces of Japan are the center, and Japan is described as surrounded by this huge dragon, which the movements of the dragons are those that cause earthquakes. You also see that there is a kind of a sword here in the head of the dragon that keeps it down. That corresponds to the place in Kashima in Kanto, was the Kaname Ishi, right? That the stone that keeps the dragon down is located. But the reason I'm saying this is that this idea that the dragons surround Japan has a very long history in especially medieval Japan. That was a common knowledge. And now, as we all know, dragons in the sea are not Chinese or indigenous Japanese ideas. Those are Indian ideas that, the Naga are sea divine beings. And so that is a direct import from Buddhism that really changed the way in which the Japanese thought of their own human geography in their land. So, so the practice of pacifying the dragons by throwing objects into the sea or by leaving offerings to temples like we heard yesterday in the case of Sri Lanka, that is also something that comes into Japan early on, in the early Heian period probably, and gradually it develops and becomes a common practice. So this fact already points to an international set of beliefs that entered Japan around, like I said, the 8th century, 9th perhaps, and continued until recent times. And this set of beliefs displays the practice of leaving offerings on the island and throw them instead in the sea. We also have this type of, like on the left, it's an image from the Kegon Engi Yamaki, and you have Zemmyo, self-sacrifice, she throws herself in the ocean so that the boat could come to Japan and bring to Japan the Kegonkyo, the Avatamsaka Sutra. We also have another example of sea offerings. This is from Miho Shrine, which is not, Miho Jinja, which is not far from Munakata, is on the other side near Izumo. But that's, the sailors were leaving offerings in the form of musical objects there, because again, the god, Ebisu, was believed to be a lover of music. And that is also connected to the cult of Azumi no Isora, for which, they performed the dance so that he could come up from the bottom of the ocean. I mean, there's something there going on. But still, you see that in that case, the sailors were leaving offerings at Miho Shrine, and then they could continue their travel. So what I'm trying to say is that at this point, it's no longer necessary to go to a remote island to leave the offerings, you can just leave them somewhere, along the main route and have the same degree of protection. Or in other cases, like I said, you throw something in the ocean as an offering, direct offering to the sea dragons. So one of the things that I was thinking about, when I began to prepare this presentation is, how is it possible that such an important set of beliefs and practices, right, like leaving offerings to an island which is in itself a sacred place, how is it possible that it disappears? So these are some possible things that, came up, to me when I was trying to reconceptualize an offering, because the idea is that it's not that the island became irrelevant or the divinity of the island stopped to exist. It's that people were doing different things while preserving the divinity of the island. So with Okinoshima no longer being located on the main sea routes, and this type of worship having become obsolete because it was supplanted replaced by other forms of worship, people just stopped worshiping it. They stopped worshiping Okinoshima, or perhaps they began to worship it in other ways. And so, for example, instead of leaving offerings on the island, offerings could be made at other locations, including before departing, or if necessary, directly into the sea. And then, what Okinoshima, so this is the reformulation, and its goddess could be worshipped from afar and treated as a hidden sacred object, pretty much like a hibutsu in the Buddhist tradition. And again, being off limit, most people not being allowed into the island, enhanced the sacredness or might have enhanced the sacredness of the island. So what I'm trying to say is that it is possible to preserve the divinity of the island, but worshiping it in different ways. And these changes in worship might have been affected by the general changes in the religious ways of doing things that had happened towards between the end of the Heian period, like 1100s, and into the medieval period. I should also point out that, again, if being off limit enhanced the sacredness of the island didn't lose, or the Munakata cult didn't lose anything. In fact, it was enhanced, if anything. So I mentioned the hibutsu, the hidden or secret Buddha images that are, again, this developed, it's not very clear when they start, this practice. Certainly by the Middle Ages, by the 1400s, we have an increasing number of statues that are explicitly advertised as hibutsu, and they begin to become an object of pilgrimage. People visit the temples to pay homage, pay respect to the hibutsu. The practice might be even older, because in India already we know that very precious statues are covered their face. And the idea is that we don't look at the statues, the statues that look at us, right? Because the statues are above us. So the idea that statues are not always visible or sometimes even hidden, and especially the most powerful statues cannot really be displayed at all times, is an ancient Indian idea that comes into Japan with Buddhism, especially with esoteric Buddhism, and begins to spread. And it affects all other, let's say, religious denominations in Japan. So this becomes a common practice. Here I just have two examples. For those of us who are not expert in the Buddhist tradition of Japan, but you have probably the most important, most famous hibutsu of Japan, which is the Zenkoji in Nagano. And since that is super secret because it's never been opened, I put an image of the Maedachi Butsu, the supposed copies, it's copies of an invisible thing, so we don't know, but which are also hibutsu themselves, right? And then there's another example of the Rokuhara Mitsuji in Kyoto, in which Juichimen Kanzeon, Kannon Bosatsu, is inside that place, and people go there and pray to it. And the idea is that Kanzeon can see us, but we cannot see her, because, again, it's secret. So I wonder if this change in religiosity, in which the invisibility of the divinity enhances it, might this also have affected the way in which people related to Okinoshima Island and its divinity there. Now, there's another way to think about this, or the changes in the ways in which people medieval Japanese related to Okinoshima. And that would be the idea of kekkai, right? The off-limit zone at sacred sites. And the idea of a kekkai is commonly employed now to explain the fact that Okinoshima is off-limit. But that doesn't seem to be the origin of it, right? Because people actually went to the island to leave the offerings, right? So it's something that happens maybe in the late medieval period, maybe during the early modern Edo period, that this idea that, it's an off-limit zone because it's divine, that is something new. But again, kekkai were, as we all know, were no entry areas at Buddhist temples and particularly on mountains. So here the images are, again, kekkai is an idea that starts in India, and it's also present in many other traditions like we saw in Polynesia, Melanesia. The limit, you set up an area where the divine is present somehow, and then a ritual takes place there. And then depending, the divine can always be there in place. Sometimes the divine is called to the place and then sent back. In the Indian model, you create a special area. The most typical one is a mandala, as the image there. The divinities, the Buddhas, are invited from wherever they are into the mandala. The ritual takes place, is performed, and then at the end of the ritual, of course, offerings are given of different types. At the end of the ritual, the divinities, the Buddhas, are thanked and sent back to where they are. So the mandala becomes empty again, in a way. Later on, this idea of the kekkai was expanded to temple areas, to buildings, to temple areas, and the entire mountains. So it is possible, why not, that Okinoshima as a special sacred place was also considered like an off-limit zone because, again, of the presence of divinity there. What I'm trying to say, again, since the topic of my paper is to see how interactions with abroad, with different cultures also affected Japanese religiosity as a whole, with a particular focus on Munakata, we can see how the arrival of Buddhism might also have affected ways in which local people here interacted with the divine. It is well known that the adoption and spread of Buddhism in Japan changed pretty much everything, not only in terms of religion, but also in terms of general cultural attitude. Think about not eating meat. Think about the calendar. Think about things to do and things not to do. I mean, many things that changed in this way over many centuries are now hard to see because they've become so ingrained in Japanese culture for many centuries that they seem obvious and therefore they are invisible. But a lot of things that are done in Japan commonly really come from Buddhism, not from Shinto or not from something else. I mean, it's really something that was imported and adopted and adapted and changed. So Okinoshima may be a good example of this invisibility of the Buddhist impact, in these type of ways. So it may be good now to turn our attention to the Grand Shrine of Munakata as a whole and its rich belief system. So this is Hetsu no Miya on the mainland. These are the three goddesses of Munakata. I swear I've not been able to find a medieval representation of Munakata. These are all the images that I've been able to find online. So, which is kind of strange because, again, Munakata cult was important, and in the Middle Ages, kami had images, right? So there must be something somewhere. But aside from that, the three goddesses of Munakata are first mentioned in Kojiki and then in Nihon Shoki, the first books ever been written in Japan in the early 700s. They are especially interesting because, as far as I know, they are the first plural kami mentioned in those texts. In the sense that these are three, but in fact that's the Munakata kami, right? Which is threefold in many ways. And now, many Japanese kami are in fact plural entities, being a combination of various divine beings. If you go to any shrine, you will see that there is Hachiman, but there's also Ojin, and there's also Jingu Kogo or somebody else. So the Hachiman is in fact like three different entities doing different things. But these the multiplicity, the plurality of Shinto, of kami in Japan seems to be a later development, possibly influenced again by Buddhism, with the idea of the emanation and transformations and so forth. But as far as I know, Munakata is the very first plural god in Kojiki that is not influenced by Buddhism, as far as we can tell. So that is interesting in itself. The three goddesses are also interesting because of another reason. They suggest a particular cosmology that is at the core of Japanese religions, but is largely ignored today. And I will come back to this in a moment. This is a diagram, or like a genealogy, of Japanese mythology. Professor Sand yesterday was talking about the mythologies, that are really important of the Polynesian tradition. Well, a lot of Kojiki is really about genealogies, right? And a lot of Japanese culture is really about genealogy. If you think about the performing arts, if you think about Buddhist traditions or Shinto tradition, everything is based on a lineage, right? On a kechimyaku, on a transmission of something. So, well, these are the names of the kami, the first kami mentioned in Kojiki, and apologize. I mean, that's why it's so hard to do research on ancient religion, because we have these very long names. that and the kanji, the characters don't necessarily correspond to the meaning. But anyway, so this is, again, interesting to me because the genealogy of the kami in Nihon Shoki begins with diaphanous and ephemeral gods that appear in the cosmic void and then disappear, leaving no trace except for their names. If you read the Kojiki, it says, kami, what is that? Ameno Minakanushi no kami, Minakanushi no Mikoto appeared, and then he hid itself, or him. And then another one appeared and then disappeared, appeared and disappeared. And that continues for a while. And then I think that these are better understood as attempts to define the kami and their powers by giving them particular attributes, but without really giving a clear idea of what these kami were, because probably the kami at this early stage were either invisible or were kind of cosmic forces rather than particular figures, particular beings that can be identified like humanoid form. Then we have a series of couples. You see that there's a dot separating them. The last four are couples. There's a explicitly designated male and female. But again, they appear and disappear until we reach the last two, Izanagi no Kami and Izanami, male and female, and they are the ones who create Japan. Not the world, they create Japan, the islands of Japan. And they also create all kinds of other kami, other gods, that become important later on because they're still worshipped at shrines. Particularly Amaterasu Omikami, and Amaterasu Omikami then in turn generates other kami, including the Munakata deities. The Munakata goddesses are part of the list of kami created by this primordial divine couple, and in particular, they are direct descendants of the ancestor of the imperial family. When it comes to genealogy, I mean, genealogy are never kind of neutral, right? I mean, they're always created for some particular reason to emphasize some aspect. So if you take a look at what they call the editorial strategies of Kojiki and the editorial strategies of Nihon Shoki, we see something that is very different. Again, this is all very well known. I'm not really inventing anything. But again, I think in this particular context, it might be interesting. The Kojiki was created by Ono, Yasumaru, and others for a particular role, right? They wanted to emphasize the legitimacy of the Yamato rulers, the Yamato no Okimi, by claiming that they are descendants of Amaterasu Omikami, and at the same time, they want to legitimize the importance of the Yamato rulers by claiming that they are, because of their genealogy, they are superior to all the other clans, because the other Uji are all descendants of other gods, so everybody is divine, but they are lesser gods. So in that sense, Ono, Yasumaru, and others were collecting all these legends, all these genealogies from different clans all over Japan, and were making them converge, hence the lines here, right? Converging into the main line of the genealogy of the Yamato no Okimi, right? But Kojiki was an experimental text that failed. after a generation, nobody could read it. So they wrote another one in Chinese, and that is the Nihon Shoki, and that is the text, the origin of, the main source of Japanese history that has been studied until late Tokugawa period, when it was replaced by the Kojiki again. So the Nihon Shoki is very interesting because it proposes multiple lineages. So there still is a lineage that connects Amaterasu with the Yamato rulers, but you also have alternative stories that go nowhere. Sometimes they intersect with the main line, sometimes they go in another direction. And of course, scholars have chosen to ignore those as variants, but to me, those are in fact the most important ones, because it is not really necessary to read the ancient Japanese history as a genealogy of the imperial family or a justification of the sacrality of the emperor. That was done in the Meiji and Showa periods, but it's not necessary. It was never done before. What was done was really emphasizing the multiplicity of the local histories and local lineages and cults that Nihon Shoki emphasizes in this way. So perhaps I think it would be interesting to study ancient Japanese history, not through Kojiki, or not only through Kojiki, but really through the Nihon Shoki and the variety that it brings about in the multiplicity of traditions, cults, and practices and people that it describes. I'm not saying that it's not been done, but officially the history in textbooks is really based on the simple model that we see in Kojiki. Let me shift a little bit, and since I've been mentioning Buddhism here and there already, let me say something more specific about how Buddhism dealt with the local kami. And of course, when we talk about Shinbutsu Shugo, the amalgamation of kami and Buddhas, that is not one thing. I mean, it's not a single process. It's not a Shinbutsu Shugo amalgamation is the same everywhere at all times. In fact, there are different patterns and different things that take place. So first of all, we have the kami that begin to be seen as protectors of Buddhism. Where does this come from? Buddhism. Buddhism was already in India, was acknowledging the local gods and building shrines to the gods before they built or inside the Buddhist temples. This is a common phenomenon all over Asia, including Sri Lanka, including everywhere. At the same time, the kami are, not later on, pretty much at the same time, the kami begin to be seen as beings, entities that are in need for salvation, and Buddhism can save the kami. So they can be reincarnated into Buddhas and be freed from kami-like existence. Where does this come from? From Buddhism. Indian kami, Indra, Brahma, and all that, they are mortal. They will die and be reincarnated. So Buddhism provides a means of salvation for these ancient Indian Indian gods as well. So this model is also applied to Japan. There is a reason for that. Japan is not mentioned in any Japanese scripture, in any Buddhist scriptures. The Okyo don't talk about Japan and they don't talk about kami. So the Japanese had to make a direct connection between their own system of beliefs, their own practices, and what is written in the scriptures in order to be able to make sense of them. And then we also have this other one, which may come a little later, is that the kami begin to be seen as manifestations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So basically, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are either in heaven or in India, and they appear in Japan under the shape, under the guise of particular local gods. Not only that, some local gods were actually clearly invented by Buddhists. We don't really know what, because local gods had no names and they had no shape. Buddhist monks begin to go around all over Japan by the 800, 900, finding local gods, say, oh, there's a pond here, there's a lake, there's a dragon in this lake. And there was no dragon before the Buddhists came, and so they built a temple for the dragon, right? and so that's how also, Buddhism spread, by creating new local gods on the basis of ideas that Buddhism had already they were very important for Buddhism as well. Now, so this also happens in the Munakata area, right? The establishment of a jinguji, at Munakata, and that seems to be relatively late, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But that implies that, so Jinguji is a Buddhist temple that is created to worship or save or help a kami, right? Literally. So the fact that that was built in Munakata implies that some of this was already going on there. Now, I was told that there was another Jinguji in the 800s, a little south of Munakata, and we don't know much about it, so it was probably an experiment, and it was not supported, it did not succeed. But still, there was already this idea that kami needed some type of Buddhist intervention, this idea early on in the Munakata area. And again, things, although were more complicated, of course, right? Especially when it comes to religion, things are always more complicated than they appear. That's not the whole story. There was a phenomenon called, some scholars call it Shimbutsu Kakuri, the separation of kami and Buddhas. It's not only amalgamation. In some places, the kami were kept separate from the Buddhas. So that is something that might have happened in Munakata as well. Apparently, the priests of Munakata were, Shinto priests, were superior to the Buddhist monks there, apparently. That's what I learned the other day from a Munakata priest. So again, it is possible that in some parts of Japan, and that is not very well studied as far as I know, there were places where the kami were more important than the Buddhas. And in fact, that happens in the late Muromachi period when we have, the third line here, that is normally called Shimbutsu, Honji Suijaku, right? The originals and the traces. You also have Shinpon Bushaku, right? The kami are the originals and the Buddhas are the traces. That is something that develops in the Muromachi period, in the 1400s, and the Tendai monks develop those ideas, not Shinto priests. It is Tendai Buddhist monks who come up with the idea that the kami come first and the Buddhas come later. And again, of course, then Yoshida Shinto and other families of involved with the worship of kami pick up on those ideas. So again, these are all aspects that are partly known. Some of them are not very well known. Some of that we don't know anything about, but it would be interesting to explore in order to have a better, deep history of the Munakata region. Since I mentioned Jinguji, this is Chinkokuji, which starts in around the 1200s, apparently, as the Jinguji of Munakata. Now, Jinguji originally are built against or independently of state decisions. The state builds kokubunji, official temples, with officially appointed monks. Local potentates, local authorities, create their own Buddhist temples away from the state network, and those are Jinguji, which is also another interesting way to look at the diffusion of Buddhism through relations with the kami, not independently of them. So this is another aspect that could be interesting to explore. It is commonly said that the Munakata deities were associated with Benzaiten, and through Benzaiten, Munakata spread all over Japan. It's Kushima Jinja, Enoshima, Chikushi, anyway, there are a lot of sea-related Benzaiten shrines that claim to have Munakata, the deities of Munakata, as their own, Japanese version. Now, Benzaiten, as we all know, is an Indian ancient Vedic goddess, sea and river goddess, Sarasvati, which became incredibly popular and still very popular in Japan. Now she's mostly a Shinto goddess, although again, she clearly comes from India. And again, the reason I put two images of Benzaiten is because Benzaiten in Japan comes with two clearly different iconographic representations. One is Benzaiten, the goddess of kind of bringing good things to people, basically. You have a jewel in her hand. And the other one is Myo-on-ten, is the goddess of music, and is the patroness of musical arts and performing arts since the late Heian, early Kamakura period. Now, later on, towards the end of the medieval period, so 1500, 1600, and so forth, we have other processes in Japan in which new ideas and practices coming from the mainland continent also affected the development of Japanese religiosity. One is, of course, the Shintoization, right? You know, the development of Yoshida Shinto at court and the spread of Yoshida Shinto ideas throughout the country. We have Confucianism, originally, well, Confucianism was already there, but after Hideyoshi goes to Korea, brings back Confucian scholars, that generates a new interest in Confucian studies, and then the Tokugawa Bakufu officially, you know, appoints Confucian scholars to train their own samurai. And then you have national learning, you know, Kokugaku, that also develops. Now, the reason I bring Confucianism here is because the most important Confucian tradition in the Edo period Japan was Suika Shinto, which in China is unthinkable to have a Confucianism that is in favor, I mean, that promotes gods, right? But that's the main form of Confucianism in Japan. So I don't know much about it. I've heard that Munakata was deeply influenced by Yoshida Shinto, especially in the Edo period, but I wonder if there was some influence by Suika Shinto and others also in the region. I mean, Kuroda-han was a center of learning and a lot of Confucian scholars were here. So it's possible that also affected the ways in which Munakata developed. So I would like to know more from you all about this aspect. And then, now I'm speeding up, but you know, then we have the anti-Buddhist back. So the Shintoization of Japan kind of ended up with the persecution of Buddhism in 1868 until 1871. It's called Haibutsu Kishaku, which kind of caused, you know, complete separation and the destruction of whatever Buddhist was present in Shinto shrine was completely or almost completely eliminated. So the history that we have now, so when we go to a Shinto shrine today, we cannot even imagine a Buddhist presence there. But there's been a Buddhist presence in most Shinto shrines for 1,000 years, which now is completely forgotten. It's also hard to imagine. So that's also why how it is difficult to reconstruct the intellectual history or religious history of Japan, because it's even hard to imagine something that was there before of this type. I only have a few minutes, so I will say something about the cosmologies that I mentioned at the beginning that are related to Munakata. So first of all, the standard Japanese cosmology is vertical, right? There is Takamagahara, where the kami, the Amatsukami abide, Amaterasu and the others. Then you have Akitsushima, or not other names for Japan, in the middle. And then you have the Yomotsukuni, or Nenokuni, at the bottom, where the dead, the spirits of the dead abide. And this is the typical kind of shamanic cosmology from Siberia, from Northern Asia, right? But there's also another, probably less studied cosmology, which is horizontal. You know, there is Japan at the center, surrounded by the sea, and there is Asia on the one hand and Tokoyo on the other hand, right? And Tokoyo is the realm of the dead, the realm of the spirits, whatever. So it is there, but again, when we think of cosmology of Japanese Shinto, it's really this vertical axis, right? Now, Munakata is interesting because their cosmology is horizontal. You have Hetsumiya, right? And then you have a nearby island, so you have the seashore in Hetsumiya, you have the nearby island, Nakatsumiya, and you have the distant sea, Okinoshima. I wonder if this sea-based cosmology of Munakata is common in Polynesia or in other seafaring societies. And I like to think that we can see here a fragment of ancient cults brought to the Japanese Isles by people from Austronesia, of which little is known. It's just an hypothesis, but you know, this is something that I would like to throw on the table to discuss further. So this is a way of a combined cosmology, right? You have the horizontal one, which is more geography, and then you have the vertical one, which is related to where the kami and the spirits are located. Now, there are other sea-based cosmologies that are vertical, but they go down, they don't go up. One is Sumiyoshi, goes from the surface, the middle of the sea, and the bottom of the sea, right? And the other one is Watatsumi. And all Sumiyoshi and Watatsumi are both here from the Fukuoka area, right, originally, and then they spread again all over Japan. Watatsumi is also surface, mid, depth and bottom of the sea. And I think that ideally the bottom is where the most important, the most sacred happens or abides. Now, sea cosmologies are related to fishing, because again, you can fish different fishes based on where you are at sea, and also seafaring, because the further you are from the coast, you have different currents, you need different technologies to deal with the waves and so forth. So these technologies are also related, I think, to specific life practices that were important for the people who developed those cosmologies. Another aspect is that Oki is probably a version of Oku, right? And scholars tend to think that Oku in the mountains, that's where the top of the sacredness is, right? Because now in Japan, there is this idea that the mountains are this locus, the sacred place par excellence. But in fact, maybe in ancient times, the sea was the origin. So what I would like to propose here is not that the mountains are at the top and that is projected on the sea, is that the sea is the original form of sacredness that is later projected vertically onto the mountains when the Yamato vertical cosmology becomes predominant in ancient Japan. So I would like to really emphasize the importance of the sea in Japanese religious history, rather than not to deny the importance of mountains, but the sea was also important. Conclusions, I have a couple more minutes. Something that has always struck me since I started coming to Japan many years ago is that Japan is not a sea country, it's not a sea culture. If you are in a big city, there are no seaside promenades, you don't have beaches. If you are in Tokyo, where's the sea? Tokyo was like Venice, right? It was a city of canals, it was a port, now you have to go to Odaiba somewhere to find a little bit of beach. It's been a huge transformation. Fukuoka is no exception, right? I mean, Hakozaki Shrine was on the sand until the Taisho period, early Showa period. Now, if you go to Hakozaki, you have a highway, and then you have like port facilities, and then there's no sea there, right? So what happened? It's not, though, if you look at it, that Japan has lost the connection to the sea. There are a lot of what I call sea cults, in the meaning that I mentioned at the beginning. New Year swimming, that is a kind of a ritual, is a kind of ceremony, right? When people jump naked in the sea on January 1st. Boat construction rituals, in which the kami, the funadama-sama, are included in the boats. Fishing rituals, fishermen all have rituals, right? Seafaring rituals with Tomohi Gongen, for example. The Miyaresai here in Munakata. And the Takarabune, right? With the 7 gods of fortune. Those are all sea-based and very common, very obvious practices that take place everywhere in Japan in different forms. But they're there. So what is the future? It's a new balance. Sorry, that is a Pokemon. I don't know if they have the copyright for that. But there's also the other, which kind of implies a kind of balance between technology, between innovation and nature, right? But there's also the other one. That is Utagawa Yoshikazu, right? The extinction of the tuna among the little fishes, which is coming up pretty soon, actually. Tuna are kind of endangered species, mostly. So I believe that the true value of Okinoshima Munakata as a World Heritage Site lies precisely in the openness to the sea and the international exchanges it allows, and in the endless capacity to integrate and modify cultural elements from the outside, a capacity that has shaped Japanese culture since the beginning. Thank you very much for your attention.